Hello, welcome to McGowan Soundworks. My name is Phil McGowan. I'm a mixing and recording engineer in Los Angeles, and today we're going to be looking at my mix for It's Karate Time from episode 9, season 4 of Cobra Kai. This is a cue written by Zach Robinson and Leo Birenberg for the show. It kind of features almost all of the themes from Cobra Kai over the last several seasons and just has tons and tons and tons of elements and was really a fun cue to mix. So I thought I'd show you guys kind of how my session looks. Now, a lot of this will look pretty similar to if you guys watched my other Cobra Kai mixing tutorial. It's the same template, maybe slightly modified, but there's a lot of new material in here and I thought it'd be fun to show that. So let's dive in. So first we'll just look at the session here, laid out typically like most of mine. Everything's in folders, and the folders are each stem that I'm going to print. Inside of that folder is all the source tracks, and then the effects returns, and the master fader that has the bus processing before it gets passed over to my second rig where I print stems. So if we want to look up here at the top, I have just a metering plugin there. The guide tracks, this is the rough dialogue and effects that I get from production. This stereo mix return is the stereo mix that's coming back from my second rig. So all of the stems sum together there and then send the mix back to this rig. Some click stuff, that's just the Pro Tools click if I need to listen to it. And then the printed audio click from the composers, which it looks like for this one, I didn't have a printed audio click, but the track's there in my template in case I want it. Then, of course, I have the reference mix, which we'll take a listen to in just a second. My VCAs. So I always have an all VCA, which is a group of every single source track before all of my bus compression or things like that, which it's great when if the cue is getting a little bit too loud and it's just getting a little bit too limited and all that. I prefer to turn down everything at the source before compression because usually it's getting a little too compressed too if it's too loud. But that is something I have to be aware of when I pull that down, that the compression will change slightly. But that's that all fader. Then below that, I have a VCA for every single live orchestral multi-track that is in the session. And below that is then my folders and everything. I/O-wise, if we take a look at that, the outputs here, you can see these are the stems that are outputting over to the second Pro Tools rig. They're going through my Avid Matrix and are getting routed to that rig over there, which we'll take a look at later. I do have these edit outputs because sometimes I have to mix a cue that has stems edited from previous seasons. I have separate outputs for those because I don't want the extra tape saturation and all of the EQ and the plugins that are on the outputs for the stems here because all of that stuff was already applied to the stems that I'm mixing against. So I have a separate set of outputs, so it's just a clean, straight pass through, and they'll sum together in the other rig to make the new cue. Then in buses, those are the outputs, of course. Everything is organized the same way as the folders by stem. So I have this little deactivated bus that looks really nice when I go to the bus menu. It kind of separates all of the groups of effect sends. And of course, I have effect sends and returns for every stem because that's what you have to do to stem things out. You have to have unique effects for every single stem or else things would be all crossed over different stems. So these are all of the effect sends for every single stem. That's basically the I/O, which is not super complicated. That passes over. We'll take a look at, this is the print machine here. So everything inputs and comes into these buses here. Sometimes I will have processing on this rig, but for this show, since I was kind of changing the tape saturation settings and so on and so forth, from cue to cue, I kind of kept a lot of those processing elements in my mix session on my main mix rig. So in here, they just come in. They've already been limited, so the stems don't need to be limited ahead of time. But they come in here, pass through these buses, and go over to these print tracks. Then these print tracks, I don't know, my cursor disappeared. These print tracks all sum together and bounce back over to these buses over here. Oh, I guess I do have limiters over here for the main stem buses. Just a safety limiter. I don't really push into them too hard. Typically, I don't ever need to mix that loud because of the levels we need to mix at for dubs has a lot more headroom, so we don't really need to crush things too much. But a piece like this definitely had a little bit of limiting going on the main stereo mix bus because it's a pretty loud cue. So that's the limiter over there for the stereo mix bus, and that prints here. And then outputs, you can kind of see here, this outputs to the 7.1 mix return, which goes back over This is all over just DigiLink directly into my matrix, and that's where everything gets routed back to the other rig for monitoring. Yeah, so that's roughly basically the session setup. Let's just take a listen to a little bit of the reference mix before we dive into all the different sections. All right, so you get the idea. It's kind of a big suite of all of the themes from Cobra Kai for multiple different characters, and just kind of has the kitchen sink thrown at it. This reference mix doesn't even have everything because there were extra keyboard parts and guitar parts that were added later that weren't in this demo mix. This kind of turned into a little bit more of a production sort of cue. Instead of me just mixing it, they were adding extra things, and Zach and Leo eventually came here and we kind of worked on this together, and we're muting, unmuting things, and you'll see some of those edits that we made, kind of deciding what to keep and what not to, because we had so many elements we kind of had to decide what to do. But first of all, let's dive into the strings, which is always the top of my session. Whoops, not that one. There we go. So yeah, this was also strings as before, were recorded, I believe, in Prague. Yes? Yeah, this is Prague. And everything was striped separately, so we have two different passes of strings here. Some of the long stuff, melodic string passages, are on the second pass here. And then up here, and there's woodwinds too, I'm sorry, we're recorded together. This first set of tracks is all of the short strings. So this isn't necessarily a super string-heavy cue. It kind of has a lot more band elements, so the strings do kind of take center stage at times. But looking at my mix of these, right now I have all the plugins bypassed because I'll sort of turn those on as we go and show you kind of what I did. But a typical tree and outrigger, no surround mics. I'm not sure why they don't give me surround mics. Fortunately, this is only a stereo mix, so I didn't need surround mics. So typically I have 7 room mics at least. I have the Deca tree, the outriggers, and then the surround mics would make 7. And then all the spot microphones, which as you can see are a little bit lower in the mix than the room mics. The ambience mics are kind of, 80% of the orchestra sound, and then the spot mics come in to add a little extra definition. So you can kind of see how they're labeled there, all the strings, all the woodwinds. They did sometimes record perc and harp, but you can see I have these deactivated because they ended up overdubbing percussion separately, which was very useful for a really big, thick, production-heavy cue like this. So yeah, just starting with the Deca tree. Here's what the short strings sound like. Adding in the wide microphones, a little more width. Then for a cue like this, I'm using quite a bit of spot mics. I don't usually have the violin spots up this loud. I bet they're turned down. Oh, actually, they're not turned down too much farther for the long strings. But these really help give some more definition to everything for these short sort of staccato, marcato passages. Here's some more spot mics. Especially you can hear that on the basses and cellos, really kind of adds the warmth and the weight to those. I don't believe there's any woodwinds just yet. Nope. Actually, maybe there was no woodwinds in this cue. I should have turned these off. There are no woodwinds. Well, those mics are there. Sometimes, that bleed from those microphones would be there if there were woodwinds. I don't get super nitpicky about muting spot microphones when there's nothing playing there. It's sort of part of the sound. So I just left them on here. But I guess maybe there's woodwinds later. We'll see. Anyhow, that's what the just raw tracks panned sound with no reverb. I have all of the returns muted over here, and I have none of my my bus information going on here either, except for the Studer tape saturation, which I always like to use on a lot of my mixes. In this case, I use the 456. Usually it's GP9. This was because a lot of the older seasons of Cobra Kai, we wanted to kind of go for a little more vintage sound. So I went with 456. GP9's, also great. That's, what they would have recorded Orchestra to if they were recording to tape. So it's a really just adds a little depth and dimension and width and kind of does something nice to the high end and low end, a little bit of a boost, but pretty subtle overall. Okay, so let's listen to this again, and then I'll turn on all of my channel EQ, which for the most part, you can see a lot of times on spot mics, I'm just filtering. I think almost all of these are just filtered. Maybe, rolled off a little high end, it looks like on the contrabasses, just so they don't get too gritty, because they were pretty hot in the mix. But everything else, I think it's all just filters. There's a little bit more EQ on the room microphones. And I'm using the one of my favorites here is the U80-88RS channel strip. But just the EQ, I'm not really using any of the dynamics. These aren't even activated here. And it's not super heavy, just, whatever the first hash mark is, not more than that. And I think I'm just using these two just to sort of soften the mid-range and sort of the upper, lower mid-range or mid-range and kind of a little bit above that. This kind of 2K-ish area sometimes gets a little bit harsh and built up when you're recording orchestras in somewhat smaller rooms. And I think I'm guessing, the outriggers are just about the same. So that's the EQ on there. So this isn't going to be super drastic. Usually I do a bit more. If I'm going to be heavy-handed with EQ, it'd be a little bit more on the bus. But let's listen to that and then turn that on. Whoops. So just a little clearer. Kind of takes that honkiness out of the sound. So that's that. Let's just activate these long string passes here. Just a little clearer, a little cleaner, but not taking out all of the mid-range. So ultimately, as you can see, they're kind of checkerboarded. They don't play together until the very end here, long shorts on top of each other. But that's kind of what those sound like, just with a little EQ on the channels. Now we get into the bus here. Got this Pro Q. So, looks kind of crazy. It's mostly just sort of, again, suppressing some of the mid-range. This, I think, was when the sections were getting really loud if they were playing heavy, because there are times when we really want to have the strings in the forefront. Sometimes it just gets a little harsh with the violins, blasting away. So you usually need to suppress some painful mid-range there. That's, almost 3K, because 2.5 to 5K is kind of the pain range. It's really easy if you overdo it there for it to hurt when you're listening to something loud. It's the most drastic is only 4.24. It's not a super crazy cut, but just some of the honkiness and the weight in the room in the full mix. It sounds nice on its own, but when you have all the other elements in there, we have drum kit and bass and guitars and tons of synths and all this other stuff. It was just a little too heavy, so I was kind of clearing up the mix so that it's not too heavy in that low mid range. Because especially for TV shows, I try never to have the music when it's turned up really loud in the dub. I don't want the music to be rattling people's TV speakers, because honestly, most of these shows are probably going to be listened to on TV speakers or something similar. So I'm always a little bit, careful with the low mid-range. As nice as it can be to have that warmth, you want to make sure it's not, going to cause TVs to rattle. But let's listen to this and see what the just first Pro Q sounds like. So not a crazy difference, but definitely, just adding a little clarity to everything. So that's that one. The next plugin is this 31102. I love this knee plugin. It's just doing a little bit of almost kind of mastering, just pulling back a little bit of 1.6 here, or not mastering, but sort of broad EQ. Bringing back a little bit of the low end at 60, just a tiny. I mean, the first hash mark I'm guessing is just a dB, and that's the biggest boost I have at 12K, and the shelf at 60. Just adding, a little bit of a happy face sound. So let's hear what that sounds like. So again, pretty subtle, but in the whole mix, all of these little tiny EQ changes that are just doing a little bit kind of add up to giving you a little bit more clarity and just a little bit more of a chance in the mix. Next, I have this Pro MB. This is really just to suppress when the strings are really getting heavy, kind of in that harsh range I was talking about. This will just, if I really push the strings up, which I have to sometimes because that's what the arrangement needs to do, it just sort of suppresses those high-end high mids to just make sure they aren't painful or overbearing when the violins are really taking the lead line. But then when it's turned down, because it's a multi-band compressor, obviously it's not really going to be doing much to that frequency range. And then the same thing in the low end here, just, if the basses get really heavy and really pushing up those kind of frequencies, then I would suppress that a little bit. Let's see if it's even doing anything. Yeah, it's not really loud enough yet. Oh, but there, just getting a little bit of compression on that upper mid. If you're monitoring really loud, if you're listening to this cue off Spotify or Tidal and you really want to crank it, that's where this really comes into play. So it's not too harsh when the violins are really reaching. But it's almost like a frequency safety sort of compressor for me. Lastly, I have the Oxford inflator here. This typically, if I have a separate short strings stem, which I didn't for this project, I'll only put it on there. But since the strings were quite frequently in this cue short and they were really kind of grooving along, I used the inflator that I usually use on just short strings. And just put it on the whole string bus, and given, you'll see how thick this cue is, it really just kind of helps to just pull the strings out a little bit without, turning them up too much. So this just added a little extra zhuzh, I guess, to the strings. Let's hear what that sounds like. Probably will make more of a difference on the short strings. But that's just, giving you a little bit of volume without actually gaining everything up, because I had to deal with sort of headroom in this cue because there's so much going on. Yeah, love that plugin. It sounds louder, but it's not necessarily gained up. It probably is a little bit. This one's kind of a mystery what's going on under the hood, but I like plugins like that. They just make things sound better. So just a little bit though, just 35%, and the curve isn't super, I just turned those two knobs in the middle up a little bit until I liked it. So that's the bus processing going on there. Let's check out my reverbs that I use on Orchestra. So I typically, here I have a short and long haul. Both of these are my outboard lexicon, so they're also routed through my... actually, these are going directly into Pro Tools. I have a AES HDIO that these are patched into. And then if we look in the I.O. here, they're on inserts here, so they're just in and out right here on these last 8 channels on my direct connected HDIO. Everything else goes through the matrix, but this one is just on this computer, or this Pro Tools rig. And I'm using 3 of those. So I have the PCM 96 surrounds, which can either be 1 surround engine or 2 stereo engines. So in this case, I get up to 4 outboard stereo reverbs between 2 units, and I'm just using 3. So strings long and short, and then the brass long reverb is also, or actually there's only 1 brass reverb, is on the outboard lexicon. So those are those 2. This symphony I have here, this is my Dreamy Orchestra. This is just, 4.9 seconds. It's pretty long. It's whenever I would just want to add extra space and kind of ambience to the strings, or sometimes we want to have a long reverb tail at the end of a cue, and this is nice to just sort of automate up, and it gives it that nice long sort of epic film score-y tail. I don't think I use this at all in this cue, but it's there in my template. And then lastly, I have the Taddeo Altiverb. This just adds a little room, a little space. Since these weren't recorded in a nice big scoring stage, this kind of gives just a little extra short but room space. So that's a main factor of my orchestra mixing as well. So let's add those in one at a time, and you can hear what they sound like. Let's work on the short strings. You'll hear the reverb more on that. Do you hear that? Not very long. Just adds a little bit of space. And for this cue, since my string long reverb wasn't super long, looks like I just used it the whole way. So that's the reverbs together. So these just sent, it looks like I just did -8 on both of them. The Altiverb is a little bit hotter because I just want to feed that and then pull back the return here. And then it looks like I also, as you can see here, pulled back the return because I think as we added more and more and more elements, I'd really had to kind of control the wetness of this cue because it just started to get too thick. But yeah, that's all of the strings in this cue. Let's take a look at the brass next. How many passes do we have here? We had 2 passes of brass, and then we had another musician here that added some extra trumpets that sounded really good. So those are blended in as well, just to add a little extra trumpet feature that wasn't recorded with the orchestra in Prague. So let's listen to the brass. I'll mute the strings so we can just hear the brass on its own, then we'll sort of hear those together. Here's with my channel EQ. So similar thing, I probably just copied these over from the strings, maybe made a couple adjustments, but for the most part, these are the same because if they had recorded them together, I'd only have one set of room mics. Though not to say I don't always leave the same EQ on the room mics between strings and brass, but usually I start with the same one because if they were together, it would be the same. And then it looks like, again, I'm just filtering on the spot mics just so there's not too much low end build. Horns, trumpets, all that. No, there's no reason to have anything below, 150 for trumpets and horns, maybe a little bit lower, 100. There's no useful frequency there, so I just filter that out on those channels. Trombones, it looks like I roll up a little high end because trombones, spot mics, they can get very sort of bristly sounding when they're really playing hard, or high dynamic. So just pulled that back a bit. Looks like the same with the tubas maybe. Then tuba, I added this low ender and just blended it in a little bit. This just synthesizes some frequencies, usually about an octave below what they are. So just added a little extra weight to the trombones. If I was mixing in surround, 5.1 or 7.1 or Atmos, this would be on a separate channel strip, which I actually do have in my template here, but I just didn't use. This will typically go directly to the LFE. And then blend into the front channels a little bit. But in this case, a lot of times for brass, I don't necessarily need it in the subwoofer, so I'm used to just kind of putting it on the channel. For this cue, we have 2 passes of brass and then those Rob trumpets. So let's turn on the other pass. I think it was just a little overdub here. What was going on here? Trumpets. Yeah, so just trumpet overdub. I think they recorded that just so I'll have control over it. And then we also blended it with these Rob trumpets here. Let's hear all that together. So those are just spot mics recorded in a small room, so they have, the very, very dry sound. Reverbs really help out with those at-home recorded trumpets. Did a little bit more EQ on those just because they were just a close mic. I didn't have any room. As you can hear, that overdub there, trumpets, brass, a lot of orchestral instruments sound great in a room with a room there for if you're doing this kind of music. But yeah, that's what I did on those. Let's add in the reverbs. The reverbs are the same for the most part of the other ones. Oh, I guess I do have this brass Stratus is kind of another orchestra short reverb I'll use sometimes. So that is there. The main reverb for brass, which I think is all I used, is, like I said, one of the outboard lexicons. It's a medium random hall. 3 or 4 is usually what I start with, and I just tweak, all the settings after that on every project and save a preset on those. That's what's going on there. I have the Dreamy Orc just in case. Sometimes if there's a section where there's a big horn solo or a trumpet solo or something, sometimes that's really nice to add this super dreamy reverb because that sort of, epic film score effect. But I don't think I use it on this cue. And then the Altverb is the exact same Taddeo, maybe with some slightly different EQ. Oh, that's something I didn't mention either before. I always EQ these. I find the raw sounds just a little bit honky, a little bit heavy. And I like a little bit extra brightness on that. So my preset here, though it looks like I changed it, this Orc Todd here has an EQ that I did when I first made this preset years ago. Channel strip is the same, just doesn't have the inflator, but it's going to have a little bit different EQ, of course. This is probably the exact same settings as the string 31102. And then this is a little bit different, but same concept. Just when the brass gets really loud, or if I really push it up in the mix, this is making sure the high end doesn't get too harsh. So let's add reverbs first, actually, and then we'll listen to the bus processing. I probably should have done that on the strings, but c'est la vie. Here's the reverbs. Not too long. Okay, you get the idea. Let's check out the EQs. So on its own, maybe, sounds a little bit thin, but again, these EQs are in the context of the entire mix with all the other elements going on. Here's a 31102. So let's check out that trumpet section. You might actually get some more of the... Yeah, just kind of clearing out the mid-range a bit. Here, I'll solo these bands for you, actually. So that frequency range, if it gets too loud, can be really painful. Let's get the trumpets in there again. I think for this, it just got a little bit sizzly at times. So this is just sort of the upper high end. Anything above 10K, 12K is kind of more air. This is really the sibilance is kind of really focused in this area. So that was just suppressing that a little bit whenever that got a little crazy. So yeah, I'm going to listen to this for a little bit. Here's strings and brass together, and this makes up the orchestra parts, apart from the percussion, of course, for this cue. There you have it. So that's the orchestra parts. In the next episode, I'm going to be going over all of the percussion. So make sure you watch the next video, and we'll carry on mixing this cue. Thanks.